Hey everyone, this episode was recorded on the way home from an unbelievable fallow deer hunting property. If you have seen the socials, we're very lucky to be able to offer that to listeners. It is a pay-to-play property, but it is unreal. We saw 300 plus deer in just over a day and a morning. It's got goats, it's got pigs, it's got just unbelievable amounts of game. Cracking country, great spot to glass over a lot of open, beautiful country. So if you are interested, send an email to the podcast, australianhuntingandbeyond@gmail.com. This one, the audio quality is a little bit not up to my usual, but that's because we were driving home in the car and there is a little bit of background noise. But look, you can still hear it quite comfortably, and there was some great information there to help you chase fallow bucks in the upcoming rut.
1, 2, 3, 4.
You're listening to the Australian Hunting and Beyond podcast with Matt, where we talk about hunting, shooting, fishing, camping, and everything else that the great outdoors has to offer. Let's get into it.
All right, it's coming up to the rut, so we thought I would grab a person spoken about a lot on the podcast. He's been a bit of a man of mystery at the moment. It's not Austin Powers, it's Felix.
G'day guys, how are we?
Mate, we are driving back from a trip, and I thought I'm going to pick your brain because you are probably the person who hunts the most out of anybody I know. You have a very forgiving wife.
Very much so, and very, very lucky to have a fair bit of access fairly close to home, which is part down to a lot of hard work and part down to a hell of a lot more good luck. But no, it seemed to try to get out most of the time of the year, but this was pretty different. This was a nice change of scenery and change of pace.
Yeah, so we got out to chase fallow, and it was a pretty damn good trip to say the least. But I thought, well, leading up to the rut, I love our conversations off air all the time because I always learn something. And I thought, well, maybe some listeners out there could learn some more, same as me, in regards to chasing those bucks around the hills. So, yeah, we thought we'd just record a quick podcast and go through some things that you've noticed and what you believe.
Yeah, it was and believe's the right word. I'm by no means qualified in anything, but I've spent a fair bit of time reading about deer and watching deer and listening to what other people who are far more knowledgeable have to say and putting that together. It's this was interesting. This confirmed, it simultaneously confirmed and unconfirmed a few of my suspicions and theories. So it's always a work in progress, but no, happy to have a bit of a yarn, and hopefully it helps some people maybe put some bits together, or maybe helps them understand why things are happening around them, and maybe if not, it's just an entertaining pile of waffle.
Well, I mean, that's generally what I do. So we were sitting around the campfire last night, and one thing I learned, I hadn't even thought about it, I thought it's an absolute cracker of an idea, is you were talking about looking at where the species of deer you want to chase or learn about, and looking at the country they're from and seeing what resources they have available. That's awesome. I've never even thought to actually do that. I've always sort of looked internally in Australia. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's a thing that kind of someone who was part of my formative deer hunting journey, not a deer hunter at all, just someone who was a fairly knowledgeable bloke about learning about different animals and things. He used to work for national parks back when national parks were a fair bit more hands-on, and he pointed out the fact of kind of looking at some of the resources in the natural countries where these deer have all originated from, and kind of food resources. Some of it corresponds, and obviously, as exactly as you're doing and most hunters in Australia do, you have to overlap that with the resources we have here, because there's no point knowing so much about how chital deer avoid tigers if we don't actually have tigers, but it can help you understand different bits and pieces. I've noticed actually on social media in the last couple of weeks, the ADA, the Australian Deer Association, have been putting up a bit of a focus on sambar feed trees specifically, and which which plants in the Australian bush they tend to feed and focus on, which can be a very useful tool when you're looking at a great big map of a vast area of kind of uniform seeming bush. If you can then work out and pinpoint which vegetation types are in which areas and at what times of year the sambar prefer to find them, it can be an extra tool in the toolkit to maybe track them down.
Yeah, well, I mean, that all makes sense, and that's what you're trying to do, to learn the most about that target species and put it into play, and hopefully things work out. So let's talk fallow. With them coming up to the rut, everyone talks about the rut. It is the easiest time, in my opinion, to find deer because they're calling or croaking, as we know it. But before we get to that croaking part, leading up to it, the boys are not with the girls. And what are they doing? What are they focusing on?
Basically, bulking up, and that was one of the things we found with this trip was kind of the boys. The boys are absolutely not with the girls. We've seen inordinate numbers of fallow does, and a lot of them with young still with them, and moving around in doe only groups. And I wouldn't be able to put a number on it per se, but I would imagine it was probably less than 2% of all the does we saw that had any kind of adult male deer with them. So the boys are off bulking up and getting ready for the season. I would think probably this late in the game, they're probably starting to break up from their bachelor mobs. But it can be an interesting thing to see where they hang and feed, because they're obviously looking for much higher quality food to put as much fat on as they can. As anyone who's butchered a pre-rut fallow buck will know, there's usually an inch or two of fat slabbed across their back and around their neck, and partially armour and partially fuel tank, because come the rut they don't get much time or have much drive to do much eating. They kind of run the whole thing on an empty tank, and that fat provides them the fuel to keep doing it. So this late in the game, I think a lot of people are aware that they favour high quality feed while they're growing their velvet, and they're growing their antlers in velvet. But I think some people don't quite click that continues on for a while afterwards. So even after they've stripped the velvet off their antlers and their antlers are hard, they're still putting a lot of resources and energy into getting themselves fed up well, because they've got a fair bit of brawling to do, and if they're lucky, a lot of breeding, and they'll be doing a whole lot of it and not focusing on feed much. So this is the pre-game.
Well, I mean, that's what I sort of like about this time of year, is that they are in the best eating quality to harvest a buck, because they are just full of fat. And the reason makes sense. They've got to have all that fat there to turn that into energy while they're not eating as much, while they're rutting and they're trying to mate and fight and, protect their space and their female. So it makes complete sense. When looking for them, what are the things you're looking for at the moment? So we're pre-rut, we're not hitting the rut just yet. Everyone obviously knows, look for scrapes, look for rub trees. Rub trees are probably the biggest indicator at the moment, because they haven't got into that rutting sort of mindset just yet, have they?
They haven't yet, no. And they may still be in their bachelor groups, but so at this stage in the game, they have probably broken up from their bachelor groups. Some of the younger ones, they don't seem to get their testosterone spike and possibly don't know what's coming. So they'll stay in their bachelor groups a lot longer, but the bigger fellas will have moved off. And as we've found, there are some cases where they're very, very, very close. Like we had one that we put up this morning, and it was as we were noticing a couple of distinctly fresh rub trees, he was bedded down just behind us. And we were right on the edge of the flat pastured land next to the creeks, so he would have had his water. He had his rub trees that he was using. He hadn't established a scrape yet, but that comes in a couple of weeks. If you have a look and you're looking around your area, it's probably something that is close to feed is the key one, because they don't want to go and spend the whole night feeding up on the farmer's best pasture and then trek for miles back into the hills, because they'll burn all that energy off. So they're going to be tied to that feed a lot more. And it can be an interesting one. There's always a lot of people kind of drop velvet stags and bucks and kind of say, oh, they're the best quality. If you can get a hard antlered buck before the rut kicks off, you'll still have that same high quality meat and you'll get a set of antlers without having to worry about velvet lock or the possibility of them having been too soft to velvet. So my preference has always been for velvet buck quality meat harvest has always been actually a pre-rut hard antlered buck, because you get the same great yield and you get a nice set of antlers.
So one of the things I reckon I've started to learn in regards to the fallow bucks is that if you're finding the rub trees, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be there for the rut. That's their area that they're rubbing off and hanging out prior to going and seeking out the girls. So I know going through the property, there was no rub trees where all the does were, but we found rub trees where we thought the boys would be as well. And the boys are going to move into where the girls are to mate them. That makes complete sense. Do you reckon I'm on track there?
I think so. I think it's a thing that it can be helpful and unhelpful. Rub trees are great because they tell you that at some stage, and depending by the newness of the rub, they tell you at some stage recently, a buck has been there and has used that tree to rub his antlers up and get them ready for the fight. It doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be there for the season. So it can be, it's not indicative one way or the other, but I wouldn't be relying on rub trees as where I'd be expecting to find the bucks. I'd be putting some more time into locating areas that the does like to be, because the bucks will go further to find the does than the does will to come and find the bucks. That said, I wouldn't discredit a rub tree either. I wouldn't necessarily say, there's rub trees here, therefore they won't be here. I've had a couple of properties down further south in New South Wales that didn't seem to have such a seasonal dispersal. The bucks would bachelor up for the pre-rut season, but they would still be in close proximity to the doe herds. So that's one that people have to get out and actually do some observations on the ground. But certainly where we've just been having a look around, there is a distinct difference in where the does want to be and hang out in numbers compared to where the bucks certainly seem to be now.
All right, so let's talk rutting stands.
Yeah, any questions on them in particular, or just my thoughts on them and my experiences with them?
Well, most people don't really talk that much about a rutting stand. They talk about the scrapes as the sort of key focus area. So more in general for people that might not have even heard the term or that might not have been looking for a rutting stand because they're focusing on those rub trees and scrapes, because I know a lot of people do that.
Yeah, so it again will depend entirely on what people are seeing, and absolutely use what experiences you're having and what observations you're making in your hunting area above and beyond anything that I say here or anything you read elsewhere, because there are locational nuances to how different deer do things. But rutting stands, or lek areas as some people call them, seem to be, as a generalisation, an area that a lot of the deer in an area will travel through and visit to find out who's who in the zoo. And you can have several different bucks using the area in the pre-rut period to come through and, I guess, get a bit of a pre-date mingle with some of the does around the area, and let them know that they're about. Fallow, there's a lot of different research in fallow as to how socially their breeding can be. And there seems to be not necessarily a whole heap of monogamy going on from the does. So they like to have an idea of who's who around the area, and it's not necessarily going to be the bloke who's croaking the loudest on any given day that may get it. So for the actual rutting stands, I've seen them work probably two or three different main ways and a handful of different ways in smaller properties, but I think those smaller property areas were due to a lack of density of deer. Where there's a high density and a large population number of fallow, they seem to drive the behaviour around the rutting stands in one of two ways. One will be a communal area that's already visited. It's already very often at the crossroads of several game trails. It's going to be fairly close to feed options. It's not going to be terribly far from where the does spend most of their year anyway. And that'll just be an area that's essentially the focus point of the rutting activity and the dominant buck at each time. A lot of the fights will occur there. The bucks will actually come in and have their fights to sort out who's who, so the dominant one can hold the area. He then obviously can hold and impose his dominance over any of the does that are in there, and as the does cycle and come to the peak of their estrus cycle, he'll breed them, I guess, in deer way. Not that they probably have a word for such a thing, but I guess it's their form of consent, that if they're happy with his performance and how impressive he looks as a big buck and he's fighting the other bucks away, if they're happy for him to be the father of their fawn. So if they're there in that area, and it's quite interesting if you can get, especially if you can get a bit of elevation to watch over an area like that, especially if you're in fairly open country, you can spend a bit of time watching exactly how the deer move around that. Very often I've watched does come into the edge of it, not necessarily, like once they come into the main bit, they get hassled a fair bit by the dominant buck. He'll actually be chasing them and bullying them and herding them into the middle, because of course it's easier for him to control a herd of 20 does when they're in close to each other in the middle than it might be if they're dispersed across kind of a couple of acres. So I've noticed sometimes they seem to come in and hang on the wings and see what's going on before they'll actually commit to joining the herd. And you can actually pick up a lot of satellite buck activity on the outside of that. They'll stay outside of the threshold of the dominant buck because they obviously don't want to get their teeth kicked in. But you can see quite a lot of them, and very often the younger bucks will be trying to herd off does before they get in there. Reds I've seen behave quite similarly too. Red deer, very often you'll have kind of your satellite bucks trailing the dominant stag rather, and they'll kind of be trying to intercept does that are coming in to see what he's up to, and the fallow seem to do similar. The main other way I've seen them work is essentially there'll be communal area, but no buck seems to actually hold that, and that put me off at first. The first couple of years I was hunting fallow, I couldn't work out why there was no dominant buck in there, and in that way the individual bucks seem to set up their scrapes and smaller rutting stands off to the side, and I found that more again back down in the southern New South Wales area. They'll seem to hold smaller, close to each other. They'll croak back and forward, but there never seems to be as much fighting going on there, and I'm not sure if that's I suspect it's driven by a lower density of deer, that there's no actual need. They can kind of get done what they need to get done by just displaying individually as one buck displaying to the does that are nearby, rather than him having to go and fight and possibly get himself injured to be the dominant buck of the actual whole lek area.
I've noticed that with Roosa last year, is that when they had their rut, watching the boys, there was 4 of them maybe 100 metres from each other, and they just had their little pocket of girls and they were happy with it. Everybody was getting on. They were still calling and whatnot, but there was no real challenging or anything like that. Everyone was just sort of, I've got enough, I'm good.
Yeah, and I've seen reds, as much as reds in general are much less tolerant of other stags in the area. We actually had I've got a mate who's a bloody good photographer, actually got a beautiful photo of probably a herd all up, males and females, of about 20 red deer, and behaving very similarly. There seemed to be the one dominant one who was controlling the breeding and the interest in the middle, and I'm sure he had his eyes on what was going on the outskirts with the others, but each of the other stags was holding a couple of does of his own, which was unusual. I'd not seen that before, and all roaring and carrying on peak of rutting timeline, so I would have expected them him to have not tolerated them there at all, and I've never quite got an answer as to that. I've sent it through to Paul from Secrets of the Red Deer, showed him and a few other people that I know in Germany and in Scotland who seem to know a fair bit, and no one seemed to have an answer. So I'll hopefully observe something similar this year and maybe get some more information, because that's certainly a big part of it, is trying to continuously add more and more jigsaw puzzles to try and get the full image, knowing full well that you probably never will.
Well, I was about to say that we saw something that I was shocked. I know you were shocked. A pig and a fallow deer doe, 2 metres apart.
Bizarre, to the point that I certainly would not have expected that had she had a very small fawn with her, because I have seen pigs, especially bigger boar pigs, giving fawns a hard time. But no, it was very, very strange. It didn't seem to have anything to do with us. We were well and truly outside of their detection threshold, so it wasn't just that we'd spooked her into the bush where the pig was. She seemed to be quite happily trundling along the same game trail behind the pig, which is unusual. Not many animals like to be around pigs. Most things usually go away, and we actually saw those goats with the pig as well.
Yes, we did.
Yeah, which was another strange one, trying to work out with the spotting scopes at a couple of 100 metres what the other black animal in the grass with the goats was, and we eventually worked out that it was, I'd say she was a fair-sized sow. I don't think she was a boar. She didn't have any piglets, but she was very, very, very close and kind of grazing in amongst a big herd of billies. So yeah, two things there that I don't have an answer for. I've never seen before. Maybe I've just been thinking it wrong. Maybe pigs don't actually smell as bad to other animals, and I just happen not to have seen them that close. But these ones certainly seem to be very, very social pigs.
Hey there, listeners. Are you looking for that awesome hunting t-shirt or hoodie to level up your wardrobe? Well, head over to the AHB store and check out the range that we have to offer. We have a variety of different collections for you. So whether it's supporting the show, hunting, fishing, camping, drone fishing, or something else outdoors, we probably have something there that is for you. Each piece is designed so that you can look great whilst representing your outdoor passion. Whether you're down the local, hanging with friends, training for the rut, or just chilling at home, there's a design to suit. Just search Australian Hunting and Beyond Linktree and head to the store. What are you waiting for? You're just one click away from representing that outdoor passion with style. So, let's get into that new clothing.
This whole thing just fascinates me because I talk to a lot of different people, and I guess that's why I love the podcast, and hearing difference of thoughts, strategies, opinions, just it all adds sort of as a bigger picture, but it doesn't mean what you're talking about is going to be 100% right for someone in a different area. And like we were talking about the croaking, and we were lucky enough this trip, it's early March, and we heard croaking. That's cool. Like there was probably two, I think probably younger sort of males, but it's all different time periods. We talk about the Fallow Deer Hunters page, and that people are always asking, have they started croaking here? Have they started croaking here? And it's all over the place. But the reality is it's very different in very different places. Croaking and rattling are two things that we always hear. What do you prefer and when?
Yeah, so I was quite surprised to hear, having heard nothing over the previous part of the trip, I was quite surprised to hear the two getting as stuck into the croaking as they were this morning, and they carried on a lot later in the day than I would have expected for it not yet being peak rut. My theory, and I know a few other hunters that share a similar theory, is that they're just testing their vocal cords out. I've had all manner of biologists say that's not true. They only croak when they're actually triggered by the hormone levels. But they would seem to be that. There weren't any. They weren't actually holding any of the does. They were by themselves in an area down just across from each other. Possibly because they didn't have the does, didn't have the testosterone levels high enough to actually go and have a fight with each other. But yeah, it's a strange one, and it's a thing that, especially with social media and people losing the depth of conversation and just trying to get everything off a 3-word comment response and trying to build their picture of the rut on that. There's certainly a fair bit to it, and just because they're croaking, I guess, doesn't mean that they're actually fully rutting yet. Just because they're starting to mob up doesn't mean they're rutting yet. The only real solution is to get out to your hunting area and get recon, and I understand that that's more difficult for some people than it is for others, with time constraints and work constraints and money constraints. But there is no substitute for on the ground actual personal observation. So it's great if you're hunting private property and you've got a landowner or a land manager who's interested and you've got a good enough relationship that they can feed you some information. Say, yeah, mate, they started croaking this morning. But I also know some blokes that have wasted a whole heap of time because on advice from locals, they've heard 1 or 2 croaks. They've then packed up the ute and got everything gone and told the boss that they're not coming in tomorrow. and trundled out there only to find that it might just have been a short window and that it hasn't actually started yet. And for instance, yes, we heard croaking this morning, but just over the ridge you'd find a couple of hundred does in different groups and no stags near them. So it would have been completely disingenuous information. My preference as far as calling goes has always been rattle early, croak or roar late, and croak or roar minimally. I've heard a few people use the analogy that you're trying to pick a fight in a language you don't understand, and to some extent that's true. You can learn things. You can learn a kind of a subtle croak, or you can learn an aggressive croak, and you can mimic those quite effectively. But I firmly believe there's a lot more nuance in what deer are hearing compared to what we're putting out, and whether it's with a voice caller or an electronic caller. And the same would go for rattling. Obviously, try to have a good hard think about what your rattling is actually mimicking. And even if you can, the best case, I guess, is to visualise. That's how I do it, and it works fairly well for me. Visualise two bucks fighting, and the antlers aren't kind of banging against each other like kids with a pair of cymbals. They actually clack into each other and will lock and grind and you can get a much better response if you actually grind the antlers up and down each other between the hits, because anything hearing that is going to hear it. I like to scrape the feet in the dirt a bit. Some of the guys that's gained popularity with people watching Meat Eater, and some people go really ham, and if it works for you, it works for you, but some people put on a full pantomime. I've not found that to be particularly successful, because I usually prefer to be sitting somewhere I've got the rifle close at hand and I'm ready to take a shot, because fallow especially can come in like an absolute hurricane. If you get one that's rolled up and ready to fight and you rattle effectively, you may not have much time at all to get that rifle up and get a shot placement picked before he's in and has either worked out where you are and that you're not in fact a deer, or he's blown straight past you. I've rattled them in before and they've rocketed past me at 1,000,000 miles an hour and didn't even look twice and kept going up the hill. So it's certainly one to have a think about how you think it might play out before you commit to it. But as a general rule for calling coming in, do enough, don't do too much.
So let's talk about the different callers on that, because you work at a gun shop, and we have had Paul from H2K Hunting Corps, and he makes croakers. I'm a big fan of his croaker. I think they sound really, really good to mimic it. However, we have been discussing that you've got a pretty damn good electronic caller. Do you want to tell people what that is and how you found it?
Yeah, so as mentioned, I work at a local gun shop on the south coast of New South Wales, Shoalhaven Shooting Supplies. Pop in and say g'day if you're ever in Nowra. We've got the AJ Productions callers come in, and they were a caller that I was quite a big fan of before we even stocked them, and eventually talked to the boss and we got a couple in, and they've sold well, and everyone we've sold them to has been quite happy with them. Personally, I'm a big fan of mouth callers, whether it be mouth imitation by the human voice of a deer's call, or the reed callers, or diaphragm callers. I've got a collection of various animal calls that drives my wife nuts whenever I'm practicing them in the car or in the back room of the house. I like that side of it, but it can be time consuming to get it right. So a lot of people prefer an electronic caller, and it's a good handy way to go. The limitation with the electronic callers is always that you're limited by what calls are pre-recorded into the caller. But the AJ production one seems to be quite good. If you go through again with that mantra of kind of call enough but don't call too much, they're a fairly large device but not heavy, so they take a couple of batteries, and I guess they'd be the size of 2 Coke cans as one big plastic box, but they've got a really great resonator chamber and speaker set up on them. They do come with a remote option as well, which can be quite handy to put your calling location away from you. As said before, with deer coming in quite quickly, sometimes instead of having them coming directly at you, it can be very handy to have them coming to a point that you can observe 20 metres in front of you in the bush, and you can be in a better concealed position. You may gain a few extra seconds of the deer pausing With that in mind, though, be pretty pretty thoughtful about where you put it, because reds especially, even reds in the middle of the rut, they don't really lose their brains as much to the testosterone surge as some of the other species do, and they will still have a look at things. And if you've just chucked your caller out in the middle of a big flat open paddock and they can see quite clearly there's no deer there, they're probably not going to come in and have a look. But no, the AJ caller is good. So it's got a series of sound cards that you can buy, so you can buy them for all different species. And the old callers used to just take one card, but the new ones can take two at a time, and you can change between cards for different calls. So for red deer, for instance, I've had very good results, especially when I'm taking mates out trying to teach them about the rut, not necessarily pull the trigger on a deer, but put the deer into a position that we can observe it and have a think about what it's doing to learn from that. They're great. They're the red deer card number 1 and red deer card number 2. Between those two cards, you've got the whole range of vocalisations you would ever need to do. First of all, to get a red stag to respond, and then actually get him either enraged or curious enough to come in. I've had very good results with them in the past with fallow. I haven't used them much on fallow the last couple of years. I've had much better results with rattling a pair of antlers together. But there's some great options out there, and people should certainly try to have a look at as many options as you can and see which one's going to work for you. Kind of if you your budget, your timeline, your willingness and interest to practice. Diaphragm calls especially. Some people just are not interested in that. They sit weird in the roof of your mouth and they kind of can take a bit of stuffing around. So I know a lot of people that have bought them, used them for half a day and then thrown them in the bin. But no, if you can find something that works for you and have a good think about how you're going to employ it, you should have some good results and certainly get to see deer. And sometimes if you can see them in a way that you've called them in, you can have a little bit more of a look about whether they're the one that you really want to take home, and have a bit of fun with it.
I think that's what appeals to most people about the rut, is the opportunity to have that, I guess, dialogue with that animal that you're trying to bring in and whatnot. I know it's one of my favourite parts for it. When you talk about rattling, are you a fan of the actual antlers, or are you a fan of like the pack rattles?
I've seen good results from all of them. Again, personal preference. I've got antlers lying around the workshop and stuff, so very often I just grab a pair of those. I like that you can very easily, like most of mine, I'll tie together with kind of 150 mil of boot lace on each of them and click them together with a carabiner so they can carry easily and loop over the top of my pack and hang down either side so the two antlers aren't rattling together. Because of course, if you've got a sound that intrigues the animals enough that they want to come in and see what it is, you only want to make that sound when you're prepared for it. And I've seen a fair few blokes kind of stuff up a stalk by having both the antlers just strapped to their belt beside them, and as they take a step, it's doing a little bit of a clack and a rattle. Can work. I mean, it could work in your favour, but I think more often it would put you in a bad situation where they would work out what's up before you're able to get a shot. But the pack rattles can be great too, especially if you have a think. Some of the plastic ones are great. They'll fit inside a footy sock. So you can actually put each of the rattlers into each end of a footy sock, twist them together so that they're quick to access, but in your backpack or in your pocket, they're not actually making the noise when you don't want it to. But I don't think the deer's ears are terribly nuanced. I know some people get very particular and they will only rattle for fallow with fallow antlers, and they'll only rattle for chittle with chittle antlers. And I've rattled them in before with a stick on an empty water bottle, and that's worked pretty well. So I think if they're G'd up enough that they want to come in and have a fight, they're not particularly worried by the exact sound of what fight might be going on around them.
So let's talk peak rut. What do you classify as peak rut? Is that when all the boys are going at it, fighting, calling? Do you think they tone down and when they're fighting a bit more? How do you think that plays out?
Yes, as far as the fighting goes, I think from what I've observed with most species, a fair bit of the fighting is done in the early and pre-rut period. Reds especially, I think Reds do a lot of their pre-game fighting and already have a fair idea of who's who in the zoo as far as who's in the area, which I think is why roaring can respond, can get them fired up. I think sometimes And that's where my preference for mouth calling is. I can throw a little bit more nuance and a little bit of something different into the calling. And again, I would, especially with red deer, I would recommend people not call too much, because they've got pretty bloody good ears for working out what's what. And if you call too much and give them the opportunity to work out that you're probably not a deer, they will not be interested. I had a mate who actually, it was an AJ caller, and it's not the caller's fault at all, it was his fault. He called that thing morning and night, all day, every day for kind of the entire month of April, and by the end of it, it would actually shut the deer down in that valley, because they'd heard a couple of their mates get shot in conjunction with that particular call being played. And I think it was the red deer card number 2, call 3 was his go-to. That's the only button he pressed on it, and they worked out pretty quickly that it sounded impressive, but it obviously wasn't a real deer. I think fallow can be much the same too. If they work out too much of one thing is not actually what they think it is. But as far as the calling goes and the rut, my thoughts on peak rut from a hunter's point of view, I don't, like biologists may say different, because to their mind the peak rut would be the peak of the breeding activity. Peak rut is usually 2 weeks after the first proper croaking would start, and as a yardstick to measure it by, I would say it's at the point that croaking can be heard throughout most of the daylight hours. As a generalisation, they'll croak pretty continuously through the night, and I've got a fairly strong suspicion they go and find each other at night time, size each other. I probably have a fair few of their barnies of a night time, and then by the next morning they're back on their stands croaking to each other. That would usually an early rut, or if there's not a massive amount of activity for them, we'll start first thing in the morning and kind of end not long after the sun's been up, and then we'll kick off again in the evening. You may get a little peak in the middle of the day, but with the property that we had down in the Southern Tablelands, we would kind of pick it. It usually hinged off the 10th of April down there. We used to have that as a fairly reliable peak rut kind of a date. I don't know, I haven't hunted that area for a few years now, so please no one down there go out on the 10th of April and then blame me if there's nothing happening, because I'm out of the loop. But we always had that, and it would be continuous. There wouldn't be a single part of the day that within a 20-minute period you would not hear 1 or 2 bucks croaking somewhere.
Well, when you talk about the photo period is what triggers the rut and the breeding cycle and everything that occurs, you got to think that most places it's going to be pretty close to the exact same time every year. Usually, yeah, and this is what I say with kind of people listening to stuff on social media or not observations, not necessarily their own. Paul Rattray is very big with his kind of keep a diary of what happens each year, set that in your calendar for next year, you'll be pretty close to on the money. The rutting peak can move, because while the estrus cycles of the does are set from the photo period, or the number of daylight hours, that triggers it. But there are factors, like everyone talks about the first cold snap or the first frost or the whatever it is. There are things that seem to exacerbate the activity outside of the doe cycling. Like those 2 that we heard this morning, I'm fairly confident there were no doe cycling anywhere near them, but they were still croaking their heads off. So there can be other factors that play into it. So yeah, I think if you can keep a diary of what's going on year to year, even if maybe one year you get out on the 5th of April and they're croaking their head off, and the next year they're not croaking as much, that doesn't mean the rut's moved. Possibly just means other factors have caused them to be bigger or louder or quieter. It could be as simple as there's not as many deer that year. If you're in an area that's immediately adjoining land that's heavily chopper culled and the choppers have been over it and put paid to a large number of deer, the bucks may not be vocalising as much because there may not be as many, so they don't have to vocalise as much because there's not as many things they need to pick a fight with. They may be able to more easily, more quietly get hold of most of the does they're happy with and not need to pick a fight. I always think heat plays a big role. The hotter the days, the less movement you're going to have from the deer during the day. Would you say you've seen that as well? Like in general terms, those colder mornings, those colder days are when they are more active for longer periods?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, colder is better, and it's kind of a good thing to go by as a hunter in general, not just for deer in the rut, not just for deer, just for all things that you're getting into. If you're uncomfortable, they're uncomfortable. So on a hot day, they don't want to be running around picking fights and parading everywhere. Their does are probably going to be less inclined to tolerate him herding them up and really aggressively croaking and carrying on. And as an extent, like extra to that, probably the fact that if you have a think about what's going on weather-wise, if you're uncomfortable, they're uncomfortable. If there's a spot that's just off the rutting stand area that's noticeably cooler and maybe he's catching a bit more breeze and has a bit more shade and it is a hot day, probably put some time into looking in there, because there's every likelihood that they won't have left the whole district just because they're not standing on the rutting stand. They're probably just sitting in the trees chilling out for a bit. So widen the net of kind of where you're looking and the number of possible outcomes. The same for that too, not weather specifically, but just as a pattern thing that I've noticed over the years is have a good look nearby the rutting stand for where is the closest bit of thick cover that has preferably good visual observation for the buck onto his rutting stand, because very often if they step off the stand for a bit, they're not going to go terribly far because they don't want to abandon the territory they've got. They're very likely to be bedded down just near there. We had a spot we used to hunt, and we knew we're kind of 3 or 4 stands down. Each of them was under a wild cherry tree. Sambar loved them, but most deer seem to like them quite a lot as well. Each of them was a little bench under a wild cherry tree, probably 50 to 100 metres away from the rutting stand. And very often if you came through a glassed mid-morning, just after they'd finished their croaking for the morning and they'd moved back off it, they would move just back that 100 metres and sit up there. They could still watch if any does came through and paid attention to their rutting stand. We'd notice very often they'd get up and they'd kind of throw a few croaks out and run down and see if the does were interested. And if the does wandered off, then they just toddle back and have a bit of a rest, because they're as we discussed before, they're not eating during the rut, and their natural metabolism will eventually burn them short of fuel, and they will need to rest more.
Do you find they're drinking still?
I couldn't say one way or the other as to what I've observed. They rutting stands certainly seem sometimes to be fairly removed from water, but I would think for basic biological function, they probably still need to get to water once a day. I've not been able to observe that. It's probably a pretty good thought to put in if someone wants to expand on that and do their own research. You may well be able to find you can get an edge on them if there's rutting stands further up the hill and there's only one water source nearby. Instead of trying to stalk them on their stands and go that way, you may have a better pick of the litter by just sitting off the one dam in the area and watching as they come through each day. The only downside to that, I suspect they probably do that of a night time, the same as they do with a lot of their fighting. They'd probably just cruise down there when it's cool of the evening, get a drink, and then go back and have a rest. So could be worth a trail camera just to get an idea of if it's a valid theory or not anyway.
Yeah, a lot of people put trail cameras out for like the lead up to the rut to see where they're moving and they arrive and things like that. But I think this year what I'm going to try and do is put more trail cameras out for the whole rut period and hopefully get an idea of what's going on during it. So have a bit more of an understanding like that for water, for example, if they're going overnight, or see if I can put it in places that can catch some more stuff that's happening 24/7, because you're not going to be there 24/7.
Exactly. I've kind of run an extensive network of cameras for years. A lot of it's on pre-rut, but a lot of it is just to get a better general idea. And one of the great things with trail cameras is the fact that they can, if you conscious about when you handle them and how you handle them, they can be a fairly intrusion-free way to go in and get some intel. I've got a couple of areas that I know that there's a local herd of red does that hang out quite religiously. I don't want to go in there and spook them out of it. The landowner's quite happy for them to stay there, so there's no need to cull them and get rid of them. But I can tell a lot by their movements by going in, and I'm a much bigger fan of leaving trail cameras for that kind of intel for a longer soak. So I'll leave them out for 6 or 8 weeks at a minimum, sometimes 3 months, just to go in discreetly. I like checking trail cameras in the rain because that way your scent's concealed. Go in, get the information you need, get out of there without blowing the whole area up, because most of the time in the rain the deer will be bedded down somewhere else. So you can just slip in and check your cameras, but it's a great idea. I've done that a few years with the reds and fallow herds in different areas. I've gone through and consciously written down in my little black book of deer notes, my suspicion of this area is that by the end of the rut I will have seen XYZ. I will then the cameras will go out at the end of February, and they will stay there until probably the second week in May. So the whole rutting period has been done and is over. I can then go in, pick those cameras up, and have a fairly honest assessment with myself of where I was on the money as to my expectations and suspicions. And very often dead wrong, but very often in being dead wrong you find out something else that is more interesting. So it's not such a bad thing to have your hypothesis completely disproven, because usually in the disproving, if nothing else, it at least lets you know not to try for that event. But it almost always leads you to some other piece of information that then leads you onto a good thing.
Well, I mean, a win in itself is cancelling out things you thought were happening and they get proven wrong. Because then you know, well, I'm not going to try that, or I don't need to do that again, or it might be just a tweak. So everything you do, I find you're learning a little bit more just to add that puzzle piece and get that wider picture, which, you know, is one of the reasons I love hunting too. There's just so much to it that it's so broad. We were talking about scrapes a bit before. How do you hunt a scrape? Do you get close to it and rattle? Do you croak off it? Do you sit there for a while? I've heard people say that, you know, a good scrape will have deer coming to it, you know, every couple of days. How do you treat them?
Similar, I guess, to how I'd hunt a water source in an area that didn't have much water. So I would put some time into probably some trail cameras initially, just to confirm that it's an active scrape, because sometimes you can end up with a scrape that the same with, again, not to diversify the species onto reds all the time, but they're similar in a lot of ways. The same with red deer wallows. I know a lot of people that just spend their entire rut sitting on top of a wallow, whereas I've noticed that most of the wallow activity in my areas is pre-game, kind of pre-rut wallowing, and then they may only visit once every 5 to 10 days, and they're not kind of there a lot. So you may waste a bit of time that way. Similar with a scrape, so it would be situation dependent. If I had ideally, I would have a spot that the prevailing wind would put me downwind of the scrape, that I could observe from a distance. I'm not a big fan of taking long shots. I like to take most of my shots as close as I can. I really enjoy the stalking of deer rather than just the shooting of deer. So my preference would be to get a spot that I had a prevailing wind would allow me to observe it, and then make a move on that buck when he was moving to or coming off his scrape. I probably wouldn't sit super close, and I would try as best I could to work out a pattern of his movements on and off, on his approach to and which way he went, because I find very often they'll have an orbit. So rather than approaching for the west, for example, approaching from the west and then returning to the west as he leaves it, he would come from the west, have his scrape, probably have a bit of a croak and a play, and then probably leave to the east. And that would be part of his orbit where he would be expecting to then find others. So if you want to hunt over a scrape, as best you can, try to work out what his likely ingress and egresses are, as well as a bed nearby. There's every likelihood he's got a preferred bed not far off the scrape, and knowing that can be as important, if not more important, than knowing that the scrape's there itself.
Where do you find they bed more often than not?
Usually, they seem to like. It's inverse to my suspicions of them, because I don't think fallow have particularly good eyesight, but they seem to like somewhere they can see. So I've found very often it's going to be upridge of the scrape itself, on a naturally flattened area. The backside of a large fallen log can be quite good, especially if there's a prevailing wind. I find fallow very much like to tuck down behind logs out of the wind, and I've missed the opportunities on a few cracking bucks over my time of hunting because I've just disregarded a log, especially a log if it's a fallen tree with a large root ball kind of thrown up in the air as the tree's fallen. they've got a real knack. I don't know how consciously aware they are that their antlers are kind of a foot above their head, but they're pretty bloody good at bedding down behind it with their antlers tucked in behind the root ball. And I was hunting with a few mates, and we were kind of at the end of the day and laughing on the way back with that kind of, oh, well, it's not over till we're back at the ute. And we immediately walked around the end of a pile of stacked up logs and spooked probably the biggest fallow buck I've ever seen. He rocketed off and barely gave us a glance to give us the opportunity for a shot, and I'm not sure I've ever got my rifle off my shoulder and around into the chamber as fast as I did that day, but it still wasn't quick enough. He was gone. So have a look at somewhere that you think you'd be happy enough to sit for a day. If you had to sit somewhere within 100 metres of a scrape, where's going to be the most comfortable that you can see your scrape? Probably with a little bit of elevation, and almost certainly with a ability to buck the wind.
What are your preferences? Because I know a lot of people say, I like to sit and wait, I like to stalk. Do you have your preference?
Big fan of not necessarily spot and stalk as one thing, but I like glassing. I like having a look at what the animals are doing, bigger picture at longer range across the landscape. But my absolute preference and my hunting style is probably summed up by stalking to well within bow range, and then flattening the animal with a large centerfire rifle.
6.5 Creedmoor?
Definitely not. No, I'm a 270 man. We've had a lot of debates about the old 6.5, but it's not one that'll be getting a spot in my stable anytime soon. No hatred towards those who shoot well with it. My fundamental belief is get a caliber that you understand and you shoot well with, and do it. And for those that do that with the 6.5, crack on. As long as you actually genuinely are doing it well, you're not just doing it to annoy the 270 shooters. But I've been a 270 shooter for my entire deer stalking career, and I like it. I like the trajectory. It's nice and flat. I like the knockdown power at the other end. I've taken some bloody big animals with my 270, and I've never once had a problem where I've had a bad outcome due to the caliber. I certainly can't profess to have killed everything as cleanly as I might have liked, but I'm pretty strict on myself, and I like the 270. It suits me more. I have run a 300 Win Mag in the past, but have had not as good a result as I might have liked, especially with stalking so close. I like that the 270 will kill everything stone cold dead at 150 metres, and it will do the same at 15 metres. I shot a young red stag fairly recently, and very, very, very close range shot, and I can't fault the way that it performed inside the carcass. It was a through and through, which surprised me. Probably purely because he didn't have as much meat on his shoulders as he would have had if he'd have lived for another couple of weeks. He was still fairly skinny, lanky teenager, not bulked up for the rut kind of teenager. And just through and through him, but magnificent performance inside. I couldn't fault that, and he was dead quite quickly. But I've had very, very similar results with my 300 Win Mag I used to shoot with, and they were not the best results. I had a couple of goats that I've pinholed, and they've died. They've still died well and truly within a distance that I'm happy with, but on inspection of the carcass, I probably had a 30 caliber entry wound and maybe a 32 caliber exit wound, so there wasn't much mushrooming going on.
All right, I reckon last question for you, because there's a lot of information in this one, and I think it's great timing for the rut to come up. So I know I've taken a couple of things out of it that I'm put into place for this one. How do you get your zero?
Zero for the rifle?
Yeah, do you go for the 100 metres? Do you do it at 200 metres? How do you run yours?
I think to work it out, people need to understand the ballistics of their caliber, and not just rely on what the box says, and not just rely on what someone on YouTube said. Actually go and, where possible, actually shoot it at a range, especially if you can get the flexibility to get to a range that will enable you to do a 50 and a 100 and a 200, and then probably a 3. I don't think, unless you're going out of your way to engineer longer shots, most circumstances, most hunters won't have to shoot more than 200 metres. So 3 can just be good confirmation. For my 270, I like 2 inches high at the 100 metres. That's always served me well. It's still fractionally high at 2. and it's acceptably low at 3, which enables me to do just the classic kind of broadside shot. I'm fairly patient, so I'm happy to wait for a deer to give me a broadside. I'm not sending any crazy quartering on or quartering aways. I'm waiting for it to get broadside, and if the deer doesn't turn broadside, the deer gods didn't want me to have that deer. But no, it puts me pretty happily and confidently without having to hold over. I don't dial turrets. I don't touch my turrets in the field. I run concealed turrets. It enables me to just go kind of straight behind the shoulder. On that back crease of the shoulder, I don't shoot through shoulder blades because I usually like to get the meat off them. Just on the back crease of the shoulder, half up, half down, so shooting for the vertically aligned centre mass of the carcass. And with the drop, I'm still happy. I'm still down into a heart shot, clean heart shot. I'm not worried about going low or brisketing it. That's always served me well. But people should absolutely go and have a look. And when you got the chance, like we're coming up to the rut, get to the range. If it means you've got to use some leave time to go and get a Friday afternoon to get to the range, if that's what you've got to do, go and do it, because you can think you're a sniper and you can think you're the greatest shot in the world. You will not shoot as well in the rut as without training as you will with a bit of a refresher. Even if that's just one afternoon that you go and just put a box of ammo through it, just familiarise yourself with exactly what point that trigger's at. I know there are a lot of guys that don't get much time outside of the rut. So there's every possibility. It's been 12 months since you picked that rifle up. Go and put some time behind the gun, because it's going to serve you better in the field, and it's going to give that animal a much higher chance of a clean, tidy death. Because I'm not a fan of hearing about bad outcomes from animals that are the result of someone not being bothered to go to the range. So go and practice your guns, and where possible, actually put them on paper at different ranges. So it's not just the information off the back of the bullet box. You actually know where that thing will hit at 300 if the buck of a lifetime steps out and you want to take that 300 metre shot.
Well, I reckon that's a good way to wrap it up. Heaps of good stuff in there, mate. Appreciate you coming on. All right, listeners, bye for now.
You've been listening to the Australian Hunting and Beyond podcast with Matt. Thanks for tuning in, and can't wait to catch you next time. But in the meantime, if you want more, you can find it at linktr.ee/Australian Hunting and Beyond. That will give you our YouTube, Instagram, X, Facebook, you name it. We'll catch you next time.